Hi, I'm Jim Schreider, the director of the Christic Institute office in Los Angeles, and I welcome all the Christic Institute supporters as well as Kitka supporters here tonight, and thank you for coming, and think you're in for a real treat.
Joe Mulligan has been working in Nicaragua for 6 years now. As many of you know, he worked with the Central America Historical Institute, which produces a periodical called Envío that many of you probably are familiar with. It's a good, solid research paper on different issues in Nicaragua and Central America in general. He worked with them for a number of years, but now his full-time work is with the Comunidades de Base, the basic Christian communities, people who have decided to be the church and to be their own theologians and to relate their faith to the struggle for justice. So, you know, I won't give you a lot of data about his life, but there is just one thing I'd like to tell you about that you don't ordinarily get in these bio treatments. When I first came across Joe, he was in jail. During the anti-Vietnam period, Joe was part of what then was known as the Milwaukee 14. People who took their commitment seriously enough to try to disrupt the war machine. And as a result, he was sentenced to federal prison in Sandstone, Minnesota. And fortunately, though, by then we had a few enlightened superiors who, instead of, you know, dismissing him from the Jesuits or making that be a timeout, they allowed him to study his theology in jail. So, you know, a little bit like Paul of Tarsus and some others, Joe did his seminary training in prison. So I give you a writer, an activist, a scholar, and a troublemaker.
Thank you very much, Bill, and very nice introduction. Just one detail was a little off. I was in the Chicago 15, somewhat less famous or less infamous group than the Milwaukee 14, but the same type of action and with the same consequences. So they were basically right on. I was involved very much in solidarity work in Chicago and then later in Detroit before I moved to Nicaragua in 1986. To tackle a topic like the church and the revolution, we need to distinguish among the various sectors of the church. So I would like to just refer briefly to the Christian involvement in the revolutionary process, and then to say something about the opposition against the revolutionary process on the part of some of the members of the hierarchy and some of the clergy. And I'll be speaking mainly in reference to the Roman Catholic Church because that's my experience. In terms of Christian participation and involvement in the revolutionary process, leading up to the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, and then in the ensuing years, one of the best sources is Ernesto Cardenal's book, or a series of volumes called The Gospel in Solentiname. Many of you are probably familiar with that. But in that book, Father Ernesto Cardenal, describes the dialogues and the discussions, the reflections of the people in the Christian community that he had founded on the island of Solentiname in the southern part of Lake Nicaragua. The book was published by Orbis Press, and it amounts to, I believe, 4 volumes. But it's not a heavy theological treatise by any means. It's rather easy reading, and I think just by looking at a few pages or a couple of chapters of the book, you get a sense of what the people were doing in this community, which was not a traditional religious community. It was a community consisting of men, women, and children on the island of Solentiname. You find, for instance, people asking the question, why was Jesus put to death? And of course, the traditional response to that, the traditional theology of that is, well, he was put to death in order to save us, for the salvation of the world, in order to atone for sin and so forth. But I think people in the Christian-based communities, not only on Solentiname, but throughout Nicaragua and other parts of Latin America, began to ask, well, no, but why was he persecuted? Why was he executed? Why did he have to be silenced? And then they see that it was because he was criticizing the Pharisees, who were powerful people in the religious establishment of the time, criticizing the chief priests, criticizing the wealthy, the powerful, and so forth, taking sides in favor of the poor, and speaking out against injustice. And that is an example of the way people began to read scriptures, kind of a rediscovery of scripture in these Christian-based communities. That is the sort of thing that Ernesto describes very clearly and very simply in his volumes of the book called The Gospel in Solentiname. People in that community, as a matter of fact, went on then to join in the Sandinistas. They joined with the Sandinistas, particularly in an attack on the National Guard quartel in San Carlos on the mainland, near the island of Solentiname. And then the National Guard and Somoza were convinced that what they had thought all along was true, that this kind of Christian community is really subversive. That was a proof of it, and it was true. The kind of reading of Scripture, the kinds of reflections that the people engaged in on Solentiname and in many of the Christian-based communities that were founded in Managua, and also with the delegates of the Word up in the north, who were taught and helped in their formation to a great extent by the Capuchin priests in the northern areas of Nicaragua. That was very subversive. It was subversive of an unjust social, political, and economic system. And people felt called then to struggle for liberation. And so we had the very important historical phenomenon of the participation and involvement of Christians in the revolutionary process. This was something that was new in history, because previously Christians, and particularly the church as an institution, had taken a position against revolutionary change. But I think due to the changes that came about in the Second Vatican Council in the Roman Catholic Church, this kind of rereading of Scripture, the Christian-based communities that were formed, the Medellin Conference of the Roman Catholic Church of Latin America, which was held in 1968 at Medellin, Colombia, where the bishops stated that they were living in a situation of institutionalized violence, and they were living in the midst of sinful structures. I think those were very important developments. The notion that the society in which they lived was full of institutionalized violence, the violence of causing or perpetuating hunger and starvation and lack of adequate medical care, lack of employment, and so forth. That is a very real form of violence, of causing people to suffer and die. And the violence of the state, the repressive violence, especially of a state like that of the dictatorship of Somoza. So that kind of thinking, then, I would say the reflections on Scripture that people were involved in the Christian-based communities, the Medellin Conference, first of all, Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965, affirming the social and political responsibilities of Christians, and then the Medellin Conference in Medellin, Colombia in 1968, talking about the institutionalized violence of the system, which means then, of course, that revolutionaries are not the ones who initiate the violence. The violence is already there. So that people who began to think of the need to struggle and the need to defend their mass organizations against the repressive arm of the state began to feel that in certain circumstances, armed insurrection could be justified, and so began to participate in that. And then the notion of sinful social structures, I think, has also been very important. Perhaps in our better moments in the churches, in our moral theology, we have come to see that sin, which for many people means many different things, but I think it was a great advance to begin to talk about sin as offending or hurting other people. That is what we mean by sin, and that obviously is very much with us still. the notion of exploiting others, harming other people, causing people to suffer, failing to recognize the dignity of every human being, trampling upon the dignity and the rights of persons, this kind of thing, is what we began to see. That is really what we mean by sin. Well, then people went one step further, and they said, well, that kind of sin is not carried out only between two individuals, but that sort of sin as selfishness, essentially, kind of can be embodied in social, political, and economic structures. And the people in Nicaragua didn't have very far to look to find the embodiment of that kind of sin in the Somoza dictatorship and the very unjust economic system that the dictatorship supported and protected. So I think for those reasons and many others, people then began to join with the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas, as you probably know, were founded in 1961. And during the 60s, they did not have great outreach. They did not make great headway politically. But in the 70s, they began to see the need to reach out to many different sectors of Nicaraguan society. The students, the union organizations, the peasants, women's organizations, and the Christian organizations. So what we had in Nicaragua was a very potent combination or convergence of Christian social consciousness and awareness and commitment, which also led to political commitment, and at the same time the Sandinistas as a political as well as military force beginning to grow. And I think this came together to contribute very greatly to the massive uprising that resulted in the toppling, finally in 1979, of the Somoza dictatorship. Other examples also can be given in my book. I have a chapter on Father Gaspar Garcia Laviana, who is not very widely known but is very important in Nicaragua. He was a priest who had worked as a worker priest in Spain. He was part of that movement of priests who decided to work in factories or stores or in construction or whatever, and in that way to come to know the reality of workers. Well, he came over to Nicaragua in 1970, and he was the pastor of a parish for several years in San Juan del Sur. And there he gradually began to become aware of the incredible violence and injustice of the regime. He also saw things in his own town like houses of child prostitution. And there was one experience that he had where he found that this was going on and he knew what was happening, he knew where it was, but he went to the judge and couldn't get anything done. He came to Managua a number of times, and there was no way of having anything done to shut down that house of child prostitution. He was also very much concerned about the complete lack of health care for the peasants in the mountains, in the countryside, and the lack of educational opportunities and so forth. But after many efforts to get some things done, and he began to work with peasants and in the formation of delegates of the word, he came to the conclusion that there was no way that anything significant could be accomplished against the system of institutionalized violence except by the use of force in efforts to overthrow it. So that then in 1977 he joined the Sandinista armed struggle, and he was a military commander in the Sandinista Revolutionary Army, and he was killed in an ambush in December of 1978. So he did not quite live to see the triumph of the revolution. But he's a very important inspiration for people. Every year in December, we have a commemoration of his anniversary, as we do have commemorations of the anniversaries of many people who gave their lives in the struggle against Somoza or against the US-supported Contras. So I think there was that very important phenomenon of Christian participation in the revolutionary struggle, first through participation in protests, demonstrations, boycotts, all of that sort of thing, and then later beginning to support the Sandinistas in one way or another. Many of the young people joining the Sandinistas in the struggle, and many of their relatives, their families, supporting the struggle by harboring Sandinista militantes in their homes or keeping medical supplies or food supplies in their home as a means of supporting the struggle. It also needs to be said that Obando, Archbishop Obando y Bravo, and the Bishops' Conference during the 70s did come out very strongly against the Somoza dictatorship. They came out quite clearly in condemnation, denunciation of the violations of human rights. This needs to be said. And as a matter of fact, in June of 1979, fairly close to the final victory of the insurrection, they issued an official letter from the Bishops' Conference giving the traditional Roman Catholic Church justification for armed insurrection. And they said that this, when all other means have been tried and when there is a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights and so forth, then as a last resort, this can be justified. They did come out with that in early June of 1979. However, it also needs to be said that the Bishops' Conference, and particularly then Archbishop, now Cardinal Obando, were never really with the Sandinistas. This is an idea that I think has gotten around, that somehow Obando and the other bishops and many of the clergy were really with the Sandinistas. That is, they shared the Sandinistas' views as to the social revolution that was underway. But then after the Sandinistas got into power, the bishops began to see things that they disagreed with, and they began to speak out and began to pull away their support from the Sandinistas in the government. That is not true. The bishops were never favorably inclined towards the Sandinistas as revolutionaries. The bishops, and particularly Archbishop Obando, were much more aligned with the upper class opposition against Somoza, because it was a multi-sector and multi-class movement that finally resulted in the overthrow of Somoza. He was so greedy and so corrupt and so violent that practically the whole society rose up against Somoza. So the fact that the bishops were against Somoza does not mean that they were social revolutionaries, that they were interested in radical, serious structural change in the new society.